During lunchtime of September 11, 2002 in the city of Jilin, located in the northeastern province of the same name, workmen were called to help fix an issue with the plumbing in an apartment building in the city's district of Chuanying. A resident of an apartment on the third floor of the building discovered the problem after waking from his afternoon lunchtime nap. Walking into the bathroom, he found the floor was flooded with dirty water overflowing from his toilet. The water naturally had a rather pungent odor and appeared to be oily, with small pieces of what he initially assumed was feces, but on closer inspection, looked more like rotten minced meat floating in the water. Angered by the idea of residents on the floors above flushing meat down the toilet, he went out to the corridor and shouted up the stairwell complaining about the neighbors being inconsiderate to the other residents of the building. The shouts attracted the other tenants of the third floor, who said they were having the same problem in their own apartments, so workers were called to shift the blockage. Getting to work, the plumbers confirmed that someone had tried flushing a large amount of mincemeat down the toilet. The workmen were well used to bad smells from their work, so the odor didn't bother them that much, but the amount of meat was unusual, so the police were called. Arriving at the scene, the police were immediately struck by the foul odor the rotting meat was giving off, and took samples to test what type of meat it was, the results soon coming back as human flesh. The building was quickly locked down as a massive investigation got underway. Residents from the third floor down all had the same issue, so police began with checking the apartments on the fourth floor. Investigators started knocking on doors, but the people residing in apartment 401 didn't respond. Asking the residents of apartment 402, investigators were informed that the neighboring apartment was being rented by 3 men and a woman. Other residents didn't know the missing tenants well, only seeing them on occasion while passing, and so knew little about them, not even their names. Police managed to get in contact with the apartment's landlord and asked him to come to the building and unlock the door for them. Once granted access to the apartment, investigators were instantly hit with the strong and very obvious smell of blood, and what they eventually discovered was easily the most disturbing and shocking scene even the more experienced officers had ever seen. Walking into the living room, nothing apart from the lingering smell of blood pointed to anything out of the ordinary, but moving into the other rooms, the scene was very different. There were several knives and saws on the floor of the bathroom, along with large pools of blood, and most disturbingly the naked partially dismembered remains of 2 female bodies. The victims' heads were found on a chair in one of the apartment's bedrooms, along with plastic bowls full of what police assumed were fillets of human flesh. In the kitchen there was a hand-operated meat grinder on the countertop which still had traces of meat on the blades, which after testing was later proved to be human flesh. As forensic examiners began working on the scene, other officers started interviewing neighbors and the landlord of the apartment. Residents of the building had little to offer police in the way of information about the people in room 401, saying that apart from the woman they rarely left the apartment and made little attempt to make conversation on the few occasions they passed in the stairwell. One neighbor said he'd seen one of the men renting the room earlier that morning walking down the stairs with what looked to be a bag of garbage. Others claimed that 2 of the men briefly spoke to other residents when plumbers were trying to remove the blockage in the sewers. They asked the people gathered watching the workmen what the problem was, and after hearing that there appeared to be some minced meat blocking the drains, the 2 men quickly walked into the building. Fortunately for the investigation team, the landlord made copies of one of the men's identity cards when the contract to rent the apartment was signed. It gave the Jilin investigators the name of the individual who signed the rental agreement as Wu Hongye, from the city Harbin, 240 kilometers to the north in the neighboring province Heilongjiang. The investigation team contacted their Harbin counterparts asking for assistance in tracking the man down while they continued examining the crime scene and surrounding area, along with trying to identify the other people renting the room and the 2 women found dead in the apartment. Investigators working the crime scene got possible fingerprints and descriptions of the missing tenants, and when searching the bins outside the apartment building, they found bags of human bones which had been stripped of flesh. In the early 2000s, DNA analysis was very much in its infancy across China, and there were few cities able to provide testing for crime scene evidence. However, fortunately for the Jilin police, neighboring Liaoning province had one of the country's leading labs in Liaoning University, located in the city of Shenyang. Blood and tissue samples were collected from the crime scene and sent to the lab with investigators, hoping it could help them quickly identify the 2 female victims. In the meantime, police in Harbin managed to track down the family of Wu Hongye, but it was little help in finding the suspect. The family had no contact with Wu Hongye over the previous decade, and had no idea where he was or what he was doing with his life. Investigators attempted to find records of his identity card registering with places of employment and accommodation, but other than the Jilin crime scene found little evidence of his movements around the region over the past several months. This saw the investigation stall, with Wu Hongye seeming to go off-grid, police finding no records of the suspect. Slightly desperate to find someone who'd been in contact with him relatively recently, police visited the suspect's former workplaces. Months after the discovery of the Jilin crime scene, investigators finally made some headway. It took visiting a factory which employed Wu Hongye 10 years ago. Fortunately, there were still people there who worked alongside and remembered him. While they hadn't been in contact with him for many years, and had no information to offer police about his current whereabouts, the trip wouldn't turn out to be another wasted one. Showing the workers sketches of the other suspects, they named one of the men as another former colleague, Yang Shubin. Yang Shubin was another native of Harbin, and like Wu Hongye left the job 10 years ago, and since then hadn't been in contact with his former colleagues. Unlike Wu Hongye, police had difficulty tracking the family of Yang Shubin down, his mother and younger brother having suddenly left the area without word weeks earlier. However, former colleagues of the 2 men had also given police the names of people the suspects used to associate with. Investigators managed to track some of the names down and showed them the images of the remaining unidentified suspects. Several people gave them the potential identity of the 3rd man, former friends of Yang Shubin, telling officers the sketch resembled an individual called Zhang Yuliang. The name was confirmed when checking identity card records, and they tracked down his family, but like with Wu Hongye, Zhang Yuliang had little contact with his relatives over the past 10 years after his marriage fell apart. With only the name of the woman left to find, Harbin police had no luck. None of the family members, former colleagues, or friends of the other suspects recognized her. Fortunately, the investigation team in Jilin had made a breakthrough, getting identities for the 2 female victims found in the apartment. Matches to fingerprints taken from the remains of the women were found in arrest records, both victims having been previously detained for solicitation. Their identities were confirmed when DNA samples matched with those from the victims' relatives. With their arrest record, police began going door to door to entertainment venues where women worked as what is referred to in China as 坐台小姐, translating to sitting ladies. 坐台小姐 were unofficial employees of dance halls and nightclubs, whose job it was to provide the male patrons with company. They would sit on stages in the entertainment venues waiting to be picked out by male patrons to provide a variety of services. These ranged from basic hostess duties such as chatting, serving drinks or food, to the more illegal aspect of offering their bodies for the right price. Investigators visited various dance halls and nightclubs speaking to the owners, promising that they were just interested in finding out information about the 2 female victims, and were prepared to overlook the illegal services the sitting ladies offered. Eventually they entered one where the manager identified the 2 women, but added that another woman who'd been working there also disappeared around the same time. The manager was shown the image of the unidentified female suspect and confirmed it was the missing woman. However, given the nature of the job and the stigma surrounding women working in the industry, sitting ladies never gave employers or colleagues their real names to prevent family and friends inadvertently finding out how they made money. Investigators began interviewing the other women working in the dance hall to try and get some information that would help them track the mystery woman down. They were told that the suspect had only recently started working there, and she rarely spoke about herself, but some of her colleagues found her behavior somewhat strange. During her time sitting on the stage, she never accepted an offer from the male clientele, and frequently asked the other women questions about who earned the most money. Suspecting she might be an undercover police officer, one 坐台小姐 actually took an opportunity to go through the mystery woman's handbag and got a look at her identity card. She remembered the woman's name as Ji Hongjie, and the card stated she was from Shulan, a city 80 kilometers to the north of Jilin. Once again, investigators tried visiting the suspect's family, but again they'd end up frustrated. The family of Ji Hongjie, much like that of Yang Shubin, had abruptly vanished from the area. Former neighbors of the woman informed police she'd left home when she was 16, finding work in Shenzhen, in the southern province Guangdong, and rarely returned to Shulan. Having names for the suspects, both the Jilin and Heilongjiang province police forces began the search, and given the extreme nature of the crime, other provinces were alerted to be on the lookout for the quartet. The most likely way for police to find the suspects was through their identity cards being registered at accommodation, but nothing happened. Days turned into weeks, and then months with no sign of the suspects. The identity cards didn't register at any hotels, apartment blocks, or places of employment. They had essentially disappeared, and the investigation stalled. It wouldn't be until 2011, 9 years after the shockingly gruesome discovery of the 2 female victims, that police, almost by chance, finally had the opportunity to bring the gang to justice. Born April 18, 1970, Yang Shubin experienced an early trauma when his father passed away from illness when he was still very young. He grew up as a somewhat aggressive and stubborn child, so his mother, struggling to cope raising him as a single parent and hoping to instill some discipline into the boy, decided to enroll him into the Wutai Mountain School of Martial Arts in the Shanxi province city Xinzhou to complete his elementary school education. There he trained in the Chinese martial arts Kung Fu and the more practical Sanda, a mix of kickboxing and grappling developed from other traditional martial arts, as a full-contact fighting system utilized by the Chinese military and police forces. Along with the martial arts, students of elementary and middle school ages would also study the compulsory subjects math, Chinese, and possibly English if the schools had an English teacher. While his performance during the academic classes wasn't especially impressive, he displayed an aptitude in the martial arts and grew into a skilled practitioner, which combined with him being large for his age turned him into something of a bully rather than improving his behavior. Once he finished primary school, his mother brought him back to Harbin to complete his middle school education. He often took opportunities to show off his martial arts training to his classmates, which would earn him the nickname Wu Hesha, meaning martial monk. During his time at middle school, he displayed little interest in his education and continued to build his reputation as a fighter and bully. On graduating high school, he opted to join the workforce rather than going on to further education, finding work at an engine manufacturing company. He also began associating with small-time criminals around the area, his ability to fight gaining him a lot of respect, but also a lot of enemies. Around this time he met Wu Hongye, who was 6 years older than Yang Shubin, married with children, and was about to inherit his father's business. However, despite being fairly comfortable in life, he felt dissatisfied with what he had, feeling forced into taking over his father's business and not being allowed to make his own choices. He spent little time at home with his wife and children, preferring to frequent dance halls, gambling dens and pool halls. The two men worked together before Wu Hongye quit to run his father's business, and having similar hobbies they struck up a friendship, one that eventually led to the deaths of multiple people. On January 7, 1993, Yang Shubin was involved in a fight between 2 small-time gangs in a local pool hall. In the course of the confrontation, knives were pulled, which resulted in one person being severely injured and another dying. After the fight, local police began tracking down and arresting the people involved. While Yang Shubin didn't use a weapon during the incident and didn't cause any of the serious injuries, his involvement alone would have been enough to see him arrested and jailed, so he decided to leave the area. For the next 5 years he drifted around various small towns and villages on the outskirts of Harbin, keeping a low profile and picking up part-time casual work to get by. During his time hiding out, he befriended another man, and the pair decided to head south to the city of Foshan in Guangdong province to make some money. Since the economic reforms and policy of opening China up to foreign investment, Guangdong had become the main destination for migrant workers across the country. Massive amounts of investment were being pumped into the cities of Shenzhen, Guangzhou and Dongguan. Factories popped up all over the province which needed a workforce. As a result, millions of people from poor rural communities flooded into the province looking to make money to support their families. With the huge numbers of people moving to the region, workers were required to apply for permits to reside in the area, proving they had an offer of employment and accommodation, which was usually provided by the companies employing them. This was done in part to try and prevent people with criminal records heading to the area to also take advantage of the money pouring into the province. With Yang Shubin believing his name may still be wanted by the Harbin police, he had no intention of finding employment to obtain an official permit. Instead, he traveled to the area looking to make money illegally. Soon after arriving in Foshan, the two men set their sights on robbing people who they suspected made decent money, while at the same time minimizing any risks, and quickly settled on going after the Zuotai Xiaojie. Many women who migrated to the region to work on factory production lines soon found out that it was far more lucrative to work in dance halls and other venues which provided services for the wealthy male clientele. The long hours of factory work saw them earn little more than a few hundred yuan each month, while sitting ladies could earn thousands each week. Businessmen with money to spend and who often had their own wives and families at home went to the dance halls prepared to pay large amounts for the female company. Yang Shubin and his friend knew going after the wealthy male patrons would get more police attention than robbing the women, so they began trawling dance halls looking for sitting ladies who got big spending clients. They picked out sitting ladies to drink with, asking them questions attempting to find out which women earned the most money. They eventually met a woman who was identified with the pseudonym Chen Juan, who looked like a good target after she boasted about having wealthy Hong Kong clients. The men invited her back to an apartment they were renting, under the guise of paying for the extra services she offered. On entering the property, Yang Shubin immediately got her under control, and she was tied up. While bound, both men rifled through her handbag, taking out her identity card and banking passbook, then beat the woman, demanding to know the account's password. Around this time, banks had a somewhat lax attitude to account security. Anyone could withdraw money from accounts if they had the passbook, identity card and password of the person holding the account. Chen Juan gave the men the password. On the following morning, Yang Shubin went to the nearest branch to empty the woman's account. Even though he knew she had savings, he was still shocked at the amount. He was able to withdraw 110,000 yuan, over 13,000 USD, an almost unimaginable amount for a person like Yang Shubin. Along with suspecting that sitting women had money, another reason they were targeted by the duo was because some aspects of their job were illegal. As a result, they didn't think the women would report what happened to the police. Returning to the apartment, Yang Shubin and his partner released Chen Juan, but eventually found out their assumption about her not going to the police was wrong. Working as a sitting lady wasn't in of itself illegal, only the solicitation part being against the law. Generally, the women could only be arrested if they were caught in the act with their male clients. Knowing this and having lost significant savings, Chen Juan immediately reported her ordeal to the police, giving them the address she was taken and held captive. The two men had already left the apartment, the landlord informing police they'd only rented it for 3 days. Consequently, he'd not yet taken the details of their identity cards to register their residence. Luckily, they had registered at another apartment building in the same neighborhood. The landlord of that property had the identification details of the partner of Yang Shubin, giving police the ability to track the man to Harbin. The man was arrested and sent back to Foshan, where he gave police the name of Yang Shubin. However, word of his partner's capture soon reached him, and Yang Shubin left the area, this time drifting around various cities in the northeastern provinces Liaoning, Jilin and Heilongjiang. He returned to Harbin in 1999 after a year in hiding. During that time, he'd been able to live well off his share of the money stolen from Chen Juan, allowing him the luxury of not having to work. But now the money had dwindled. Given the success he'd had in Foshan, he planned to return to Guangdong and once again rob a sitting woman, but first wanted to find people to join him, so he started seeking out old friends. He first reconnected with Wu Hongye, whose life had been gradually falling apart since the two men last met. His gambling had seen him run up huge debts, the business he inherited had failed, and he was now estranged from his family, wife and children. When Yang Shubin informed him about the robbery he committed in Foshan and the plans for another, Wu Hongye was interested but remained hesitant about joining him. Yang Shubin soon found someone keener to partner with him after bumping into another old acquaintance, this time a former classmate from his primary school days from before he was sent to attend the martial arts school in Shanxi, Zhang Yuliang. Zhang Yuliang had been the polar opposite of Yang Shubin during their time in school. He was frequently one of the top-performing students among his peers throughout his education, and had always been picked out by his class teachers to perform as the head boy in his classes. He'd gone on to attend university, finding a good job after graduating. Eventually he decided to start his own business, which did well, affording him a comfortable life. Yet when he crossed paths with Yang Shubin, he had lost almost everything, and was essentially homeless, relying on handouts from friends just to get by each day. His struggles began once his marriage fell apart. In the traditional Chinese marriage, the husband was expected to be the breadwinner and the wife the homemaker. Part of this included the woman taking care of the family finances. Husbands were expected to hand the majority of their income over to the wife to control. Zhang Yuliang had followed the tradition, but once his wife had access to the money, she cleaned out his bank accounts and vanished with another man, leaving him penniless. His business collapsed shortly after, leaving him unable to afford to pay for his home. He was struggling to rebuild his life when he bumped into Yang Shubin, who offered to help. The experience left Zhang Yuliang with an extremely deep-seated hatred of women, so when Yang Shubin told him he was looking for a partner, Zhang Yuliang didn't hesitate to agree to heading south with him. The two men made the 3,000-kilometer journey south to Guangdong in the December of 1999 and rented an apartment in Shenzhen City. Shenzhen was much larger and wealthier than Foshan, attracting a significant number of businessmen from Hong Kong and Taiwan, who made sure to take advantage of the nightlife on offer, while their wives were out of sight and out of mind back home. Once settled, the two men wasted no time in frequenting different dance halls around the city, looking for a woman who had big spending clients. They soon set their sights on a young woman who'd migrated to Shenzhen from the neighboring province Hunan, who'd be referred to with the pseudonym Xiaoli. They eventually got the young woman to come back to the apartment they were renting, Yang Shubin quickly subduing her before both men tied her up. The men then beat the woman to get the password to her banking passbook, and the following morning Yang Shubin once again went to the nearest branch and emptied the woman's bank account, this time withdrawing 100,000 yuan, 12,000 USD. Returning to the apartment, the two men discussed what they were going to do with their hostage. They decided to let her go, intending to return to the northeast straight after. Once they untied the woman and removed the gag from her mouth, the terrified Xiaoli panicked and began shouting and screaming for help, running over to a window and smashing the thin glass, punching at it in desperation to escape. The men quickly got her under control again, and while Zhang Yuliang kept her subdued, Yang Shubin went out to look around the corridors of the building to see if her shouts had attracted the attention of any neighbors. It appeared that other residents of the building either didn't hear her or just ignored her cries for help, thinking it was just a couple having a domestic argument. Once Yang Shubin returned to the apartment, Zhang Yuliang suggested that ending the woman's life was the safer choice. They suffocated Xiaoli, then decided to get rid of the evidence by breaking the body down using a meat grinder that was in the apartment's kitchen to help them dispose of the parts more easily. Anything they couldn't process through the meat grinder was placed into garbage bags and dumped in various bins around the neighborhood. Trash was collected daily by sanitation workers, and the remains would end up being buried in a landfill site without ever being discovered. They then cleaned the apartment, removing any visible evidence of the gruesome work before moving on. Not having to worry about their robbery being reported to the police, the men decided to stay in the region, rather than returning to the northeast. They next arrived in Guangzhou, another large wealthy city just 130 kilometers to the northwest of Shenzhen. Arriving in the city and renting an apartment, the pair, eager to follow up on their success in Shenzhen, immediately began haunting the dance halls for their next target, but the first woman they selected ended up joining them, Ji Hongjie. Ji Hongjie was only 19 at the time the men picked her out and had been working in Guangzhou for 3 years. She moved south after finding factory work at the age of 16, but later changed her career to that of a sitting lady. She needed to earn money to support her family and pay her younger brother's tuition fees, and working in dance halls allowed her to make and save much more than factory work. In mid-January the year 2000, after sitting with Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang, she agreed to go back to their apartment. As with the two previous women Yang Shubin targeted, she was tied up and beaten, the men demanding she give them the password to her banking passbook. Despite her young age, Ji Hongjie proved to be more defiant than the previous victims. She began appealing to their shared connection of being northeastern outsiders in the south of the country. While some people outside China can often view Chinese culture, especially among the Han majority ethnic group, as being somewhat monolithic, each region and province has distinct cultural differences. Traditional foods, music, hobbies and belief systems in one area of the country can be completely unknown in another. Dialects of Chinese can vary wildly in the different provinces, and even in different counties of cities. If someone has a strong taste for extremely spicy food with tongue-numbing spices, then it would be reasonable to assume they were Chongqing or Sichuan natives. If people are seen playing the card game Zipai, which is similar to Mahjong, then it's almost guaranteed they will be from Hunan province. Partaking in zaocha, or morning tea, is an important part of the local culture for many people native to Guangdong. Many of the migrant workers who moved south to Guangdong during this period had rarely been outside their home province or even village before, so when arriving in the region they tended to gravitate towards befriending people from the same area due to the shared cultural background. While Ji Hongjie was native to Jilin, and the men holding her hostage were Heilongjiang natives, the two provinces along with Liaoning are known as Dongbei, literally translating to northeast, and share similar cultures. As the two men continued to try and get her password, Ji Hongjie told them she'd already sent the money she had home to help her family, and she only had 80 yuan, less than 10 USD left in her account. At first they didn't believe her, but she told them she was their Dongbei sister, and northeasterners were honest people, appealing to their shared cultural background. Eventually her words got through to the men and they untied her. However, Yang Shubin had other reasons for showing mercy. One was that he was very attracted to Ji Hongjie, and was impressed that she never showed fear when being held captive. The other was that he felt she may be useful to them in finding other women to target. Yang Shubin offered her the opportunity to join them, telling her how much money his previous crimes made him. This, combined with the fact she'd now only be acting as a sitting lady, was an offer too good for Ji Hongjie to refuse. The trio stayed in Guangzhou, with the men keen to test out the newest member. Her role was to find another sitting lady job, but only to talk to the other women and befriend the highest earners. To prevent potential witnesses seeing the three of them together, Yang Shubin rented an apartment for Ji Hongjie located in one of the better residential communities in the city, while he and Zhang Yuliang resided in another, much cheaper apartment. Ji Hongjie living in higher-end accommodation would make it less suspicious when she eventually invited the women she befriended to the home, and the community chosen was a location where businessmen rented apartments for their mistresses. It was fairly common practice for the wealthy businessmen coming to the city and frequenting the various entertainment venues to pick out a favorite woman and making her their xiaosen, which literally translates to little three, a Chinese term meaning mistress. Once a woman became a xiaosen, the men either rented or bought apartments for them, while also covering their daily living costs, giving them a regular allowance. Ji Hongjie soon found two potential targets without having to work the dance halls, befriending two sisters sharing an apartment in the same residential community who were mistresses to wealthy businessmen. Getting to know the two women, referred to with the pseudonyms Zhang Li and Zhang Qiang, she found out how much money the men they were seeing supposedly gave them, and passed the information on to Yang Shubin. In early 2000, she told the sisters her boyfriend, who she described as the boss of a large Beijing company, was coming to visit, and invited them to a meal. Yang Shubin hosted the dinner at one of the city's better hotels, with Zhang Yuliang pretending he was a business partner. After dinner they all headed back to the apartment where Ji Hongjie resided. Once inside, the men got control of the women and tied them up before placing them in separate rooms. Ji Hongjie had felt one of the sisters, Zhang Qiang, had looked down on her when they got to know each other, and asked if she could participate in the beatings to exact some revenge. She beat Zhang Qiang about the face with various implements from the kitchen, resulting in her knocking out several of the woman's teeth. Once they had the PIN codes for the bank cards, Yang Shubin went to clean out the accounts but found there was only a total of 60,000 yuan, just over 7,000 USD in the accounts. When talking to Ji Hongjie, the sisters had boasted about how wealthy their boyfriends were, leading the trio now holding them captive to believe they were holding back on them. To get the truth, the sisters were stripped naked, and over the course of the next 3 days were subjected to all manner of abuse by Yang Shubin, Zhang Yuliang and Ji Hongjie, with various items they had in the apartment. Pliers, rolling pins, toothpicks and corn on the cob were used to get the sisters to say where they were hiding their money. However, no matter what indignity was forced on them, they continued to say there wasn't any more money. Eventually the trio had to accept what the sisters said and left the apartment, leaving them naked, bound and gagged in the room. The 2 sisters managed to break free and reported the ordeal to the police after their escape. However, Yang Shubin purchased a fake identity card after the first robbery and the arrest of the person working with him, and used the false identity to register his residence at the apartment, leaving police looking for someone who didn't exist. While investigators in Guangzhou hunted the false identity, Yang Shubin, Zhang Yuliang, and Ji Hongjie were already back in Shenzhen looking for their next target. Ji Hongjie was sent out to befriend potential victims. She found work in one of the city's dance halls in the Luohu district close to the Hong Kong border, which received plenty of big-spending patrons. She soon befriended a woman from Sichuan province referred to by the pseudonym Xiaochang, who was especially popular with the clientele. Ji Hongjie invited Xiaochang to the apartment Yang Shubin was renting, and like the other women before her was tied up and beaten by the trio until she gave them her bank details. When he went to withdraw the money, Yang Shubin discovered Ji Hongjie had made an excellent choice. The amount in the account was far more than he could believe, and too much to withdraw in one go. Over the next few days, each member of the gang made trips to the bank individually to withdraw the money, which totaled 500,000 yuan, 60,000 USD. Since Xiaochang had made such an astonishing amount, they believed other women at the dance hall may also have significant savings, so forced their hostage to call one of her colleagues who also had big spending clients. The unfortunate woman invited to the apartment by Xiaochang was referred to with the pseudonym Xiaochen. The same scenario played out, however the gang would be left somewhat disappointed, Xiaochen only having 28,000 yuan, 3,300 USD saved in her account. The main reason the gang had let the previous women survive was because they believed the victims would be too scared to report the robbery and the days of abuse they endured for only 60,000 yuan. In this incident they had taken 500,000, so felt the robbery would certainly be reported, and given the amount stolen, the police would treat the case seriously, so they decided their victims had to disappear. Ji Hongjie was sent out to purchase the necessary items to get the job done from the local hardware store. These included meat cleavers, bone scrapers, saws, and crucially a meat grinder. The 2 women were suffocated to death, before the gang all participated in breaking down the bodies, disposing of what they couldn't process with the grinder and garbage bins around the area, making sure no trace of the victims was found. Not long after the incident, Ji Hongjie and Yang Shubin started an intimate relationship, and the trio stayed in Shenzhen, living comfortably off the money stolen from Xiaochang and Xiaochen. There were no further incidents for the next 18 months, until while on an evening out in the Shenzhen dance halls, they met someone named Liu Aibin. Liu Aibin had an extensive criminal record, and Yang Shubin felt he could be a useful addition to the gang, but wanted the man to prove his worth. He told the others about a woman he knew in his home city Weihai, in the eastern province Shandong, 2,100 kilometers from Shenzhen. He claimed the woman and her husband were running 2 successful beauty salons, and making a lot of money. The 3 men traveled to Shandong without Ji Hongjie and began stalking the target, getting familiar with her movements and routines over the following weeks. In the June of 2001, the woman referred to with the pseudonym Liu Mo exited her car outside her home when she was grabbed by Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang. As Liu Mo was forced into the back of the vehicle, Liu Aibin got into the driver's seat and drove to an apartment the 3 men were renting. Once more they tied their victim up before telling Liu Aibin to beat the hostage to get her bank card PIN code. The assault wasn't necessary. Liu Mo was fully prepared to give them the information, but Yang Shubin wanted to test Liu Aibin. On being given the PIN code, Liu Aibin was sent out to withdraw money from ATMs around the city, with Zhang Yuliang going with him to make sure he didn't attempt to abscond with the cash. They managed to clear the woman's bank account of 200,000 yuan, a little over 24,000 USD. This time they released the woman alive before Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang left the area and headed to the city of Qingdao 250 kilometers away, after splitting the money with Liu Aibin, who decided to stay in Weihai. However, it proved to be a poor decision from Liu Aibin. The victim reported her experience to the police, who later got images of Liu Aibin from the ATMs. 10 days later he was arrested and confessed to his role in the robbery, after being shown the surveillance camera footage police had of him. When Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang had previously withdrawn money from cash machines and banks, they made sure to wear items that obscured their faces. Liu Aibin hadn't taken the same precautions, and Zhang Yuliang kept himself off cameras when they withdrew the money together. While Liu Aibin confessed to his role in the robbery, he refused to give police the names of the other men involved, and was eventually sent to prison for the incident, leaving Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang free to continue on with their criminal activity. 4 months later, in the October of 2001, Zhang Yuliang received a massage with special extras at a hotel in Qingdao. Speaking with the woman, he got the impression that she was earning good money and informed Yang Shubin. The woman was later invited to the apartment being rented by Yang Shubin with his false identity card, and she was subjected to the same experience 5 other women had gone through, the men getting their hands on another 100,000 yuan, around 12,000 USD. They let the woman go once they had the money, but she wouldn't come forward to the police with her story until years later. The 2 men returned to Shenzhen and Jihongjie, and were surprised to be visited by Wu Hongye, who Yang Shubin hadn't seen since they discussed working together 3 years prior. The life of Wu Hongye hadn't improved in that time. While Yang Shubin and the others were financially comfortable, he was flat broke with debt collectors looking for him. Despite having enough money to help him out, Yang Shubin decided it was better to commit another robbery than pull Wu Hongye into the game. Jihongjie found work in another dance hall and began making friends to root out the big earners. She befriended an unidentified woman, convincing her to come to the same apartment where the gang ended the lives of Xiaochang and Xiaochen 2 years prior, which Yang Shubin was still renting. Once they had her banking information, they then repeated what they'd done previously and told the woman to invite a colleague to come to the apartment. The second unidentified woman was also forced to give the gang her bank card's PIN code, and they withdrew 180,000 yuan, 21,000 USD from the 2 women's accounts, before ending their lives and disposing of their bodies in the same grisly way they had with previous victims. It was another case in which no trace of the women would be found, and their deaths not known about until almost a decade later. Shortly after this, the gang returned to the northeast, heading to Shulan, the home city of Jihongjie. When making a rare call to her family, she found out her father was sick and in hospital, so decided to return home to see him. She only spent a short time with her family before moving to Jilin to an apartment the men were renting, ready to do another job so she could give the extra money to her family to pay for her father's medical treatment. She took a job in a dance hall and soon had a target, a woman identified with the pseudonym Xiaolin. It wasn't long before Xiaolin would be invited to the apartment where her partially dismembered body was discovered after the gang blocked the building's water pipes. After she was tied up and beaten to get her bank card PIN code, as with the incident that took place in Shenzhen only 5 months prior, the gang forced her to call another woman and invite her to the apartment. The second woman identified with the pseudonym Xiaolan arrived at the apartment and was subjected to the same treatment as her friend. The gang then cleared out the women's bank accounts, netting themselves 160,000 yuan, over 19,000 USD. The women were then suffocated to death, and the gang began disposing of the bodies. However, this time they were unable to finish the job, blocking the drains to the apartment building, eventually leading to the police being called, and their crimes being discovered. With how successful they'd been at fully disposing of their victims without trace, they'd become complacent, flushing the minced flesh down the toilet and crucially, renting the apartment with the identity card of Wu Hongye. The incident was the first time they were unable to make their victims disappear completely, being interrupted by the shouts of the neighbors as they were only partway through breaking the bodies down. Once they realized what had happened, the quartet dropped everything and left the building. They headed straight to the closest train station, then boarded a train heading to Beijing, before getting on another train destined for Botou, a city located in the northern province of Inner Mongolia, 1,600 kilometers from the Jilin crime scene. They rented an apartment for the four of them in the city using the fake identity card of Yang Shubin, and began planning their next move. Now their crimes had been exposed, they knew the longer the hunt continued without investigators in Jilin and Harbin tracking them down, police across the country would soon be looking for them. Their only chance of avoiding arrest, while living something resembling a normal life, was to completely change their identities. For the first few months as fugitives, the quartet hid in the apartment, only Ji Hongjie going out to buy food and other necessities. Eventually, as time passed with no sign of the police being close to them, they got a little more comfortable and split up. Yang Shubin and Ji Hongjie kept the original apartment, while Zhang Yuliang and Wu Hongye moved out. They found a small cheap room where the landlord didn't worry too much about residents registering identity cards. After moving out, Wu Hongye met a woman from Shanxi. Having worked in the city for several years, she was in the process of changing her hukou, meaning household registration, from that of her hometown to Botou. The hukou, or household registration certificate, notes the location of a Chinese citizen's birth, and is vital for many aspects of people's lives. While having fake identity cards could help the gang avoid detection, being unable to use their hukou severely limited what they would be able to do. Wu Hongye introduced his new girlfriend to Yang Shubin, who asked her about how she was going about changing her hukou. To do so through normal channels was a long, difficult bureaucratic nightmare. However, the girlfriend of Wu Hongye explained that she had contacts in her hometown's police who were helping the process. Having a good sense of why Yang Shubin was so interested, she went on to say her friends could produce certificates for fake identities, but it would cost. After each robbery, the gang had shared the money stolen equally, so three of the group had more than enough to pay for their new identities. Zhang Yuliang had been involved in all the robberies, except the first, while Yang Shubin and Ji Hongjie being together saw them combine their earnings. None of them spent recklessly or had extravagant lifestyles, saving much of the money they'd stolen. Wu Hongye, however, had only recently joined and hadn't made enough to cover the cost of the new identity paperwork while leaving him with enough money to live. The others believed if he didn't also change his identity, then it put them all at risk of being exposed, so decided to get more money to help Wu Hongye disappear with them. In early 2003, the quartet traveled to Taizhou, a city in the southeastern province Zhejiang, 2,000 kilometers from Botou. Ji Hongjie went to work, and soon enough two of her new colleagues found themselves being invited back to her home. The unidentified women had their lives ended after handing over their banking details to the gang, allowing them to withdraw a total of 160,000 yuan, almost 20,000 USD. This time, when disposing of their victims, they were much more careful, getting rid of the remains in various locations around the city and surrounding countryside, rather than lazily flushing them down the toilet. Only weeks later, Ji Hongjie found another target in a different dance hall, the unidentified woman ultimately suffering the same fate as the previous victims, the gang stealing a further 80,000 yuan, 9,500 USD. They then left the city with no trace of the three women ever being found. Returning to Botou, they paid the money for the new identity cards and household registration certificates. Yang Shubin and Ji Hongjie also got new identities for their parents and siblings, who then joined them in Botou not long after. With their new official identities, the quartet, who collectively had committed multiple violent robberies and 10 homicides, effectively vanished. In 2011, Harbin police officer Xu Jianguo, in a quiet moment, was going through case files of wanted fugitives when he noticed a face that reminded him of an old classmate from his junior school days. The image belonged to Yang Shubin, and despite the man he was looking at being much older, there remained a strong resemblance to the person he knew when they were young. He only vaguely remembered the name Yang Shubin, so decided to show the image to other old classmates he was still in contact with to confirm his suspicions, and they'd agree it was the same person. At the time of the Jilin case 9 years ago, Xu Jianguo was working in a different section of the police in Harbin, and his department didn't participate in the investigation. But now, since he was familiar with old friends of the suspect, he decided to start looking into the whereabouts of Yang Shubin. He found no record of the man on registration records for almost a decade, and none of their old classmates had heard anything about him for even longer. He tried to track down the mother and younger brother of Yang Shubin, but found out they'd suddenly disappeared from the area several years ago. He next tried contacting the families of the other suspects. The relatives of both Zhang Yuliang and Wu Hongye said they hadn't had any contact with the missing men for many years. He then discovered that, like the family of Yang Shubin, the family of Ji Hongjie had also vanished abruptly at a similar time. Xu Jianguo felt the timing of the two families' disappearance was far too coincidental, so despite the apparent roadblock in his informal investigation, he continued to look into the whereabouts of Yang Shubin on his own time. His persistence would pay off when he eventually tracked down someone from the area he and Yang Shubin grew up, who remembered that the younger brother of the suspect had been in Harbin sometime around 2006, 3 years after his apparent disappearance. The man remembered having dinner with the brother Yang Shukai, who claimed he'd been doing business in various provinces around the country. The man went on to say Yang Shukai got into an altercation with someone a few days later, resulting in him needing hospital treatment, an incident which wasn't reported to the police. During his brief hospital stay, Yang Shukai called the man asking him to bring him some items, and when the man arrived, he noticed the name card on his old friend's bed stated his name was Wang Xuekai and not Yang Shukai. While the final character of the name, Kai, was the same, both the family name and the first character of the given name were different. Xu Jianguo got the hospital records for the person named Wang Xuekai and quickly found out the address the person gave was fake. Xu Jianguo began searching through Harbin residential registration records for people named Wang Xuekai with no results. He then expanded the search through records for the whole of Heilongjiang and then the other 2 Dongbei provinces, but again came up empty. This left him facing the daunting prospect of looking for Wang Xuekai across the rest of the country, coming up with a large number of matches. He painstakingly began making his way through the household registration records for each individual until he came to one which stood out. There was a Wang Xuekai with a Baotou hukou, whose mother's name was Liu Fengyun, which matched the mother's name on the Harbin hukou belonging to Yang Shubin. Looking at the Baotou hukou of Liu Fengyun, it stated she had 2 sons. Along with Wang Xuekai, there was an older son named Wang Xueli. Officer Xu Jianguo suspected the older son was in fact Yang Shubin, so started looking through official records for the person named Wang Xueli. His suspicion was soon confirmed, the identity card photo of Wang Xueli proving he was in reality Yang Shubin. He then found a marriage certificate under the name Wang Xueli, showing that he'd married a woman named Ma Haiyan. The couple's marriage certificate's photograph showed that Ma Haiyan strongly resembled Ji Hongjie. Continued investigation proved that a man registered as a cousin of Wang Xueli named Wang Xueguo was in fact the 3rd fugitive Zhang Yuliang, with another cousin Wang Huayan being the 4th wanted man Wu Hongye. Xu Jianguo took his discovery to higher-ups, and police in Baotou were subsequently told of the information and asked to place the suspects under surveillance, while an investigation team from Harbin made their way to the city. Investigators in Baotou discovered that while residing in the city, Yang Shubin and Ji Hongjie had started a family, having 2 children. Both Zhang Yuliang and Wu Hongye also started their own families, Zhang Yuliang marrying a local woman and Wu Hongye marrying the woman who'd helped them get their new identities. All suspects were running small businesses around Baotou, something that would have been impossible without the fake hukou. Yang Shubin and Ji Hongjie collectively ran 2 pool halls and a footbath parlor, with Yang Shubin managing the former and Ji Hongjie the latter. Zhang Yuliang also bought his own home and opened a store selling mattresses. Wu Hongye had bought a home out of the city center and started a business selling coal. On October 25, 2011, the investigation team arrived in Baotou and set about arresting the suspects. The first to be taken into police custody was Ji Hongjie. Arrested at the footbath parlor she owned, she made no attempt to resist or hide who she was, giving police her real name rather than the false identity. The three men would all be arrested without incident moments later, and the quartet were transported back to Jilin for interrogation. Initially, the interrogations only focused on the homicide of the two women whose partially dismembered remains were found in the Jilin apartment on September 11, 2002, but soon investigators discovered the gang committed many more crimes. In the aftermath of their homicides, they'd done such a thorough job of disposing of their victims, the police in the cities the incidents took place were unaware the crimes even happened. Some of the victims had been eventually reported missing, but as most of them were migrants living and working in different provinces, their families often failed to realize they were missing until months after the bodies were disposed of. Furthermore, due to the nature of their jobs as sitting ladies, employers, friends and colleagues also didn't think much of them going missing. Dance halls frequently had high staff turnover for various reasons. Finding work in another city or dance hall, leaving the industry completely, getting married, or returning to their hometowns were all explanations why the women could be there one day and gone the next. Women leaving jobs and never seeing or contacting the people they worked with and befriended again wasn't especially unusual or noteworthy. In cases where the women were allowed to walk away with their lives, and some reporting the robberies to the police, again given the nature of the work they did, police wouldn't put too much effort or resources into tracking down the people responsible, viewing the robberies as just being another risk of the job. However, when the news of the gang's arrest broke and began making headlines in the media, one woman who'd been allowed to live recognized some of the suspects and came forward with her own story. Other surviving victims were reticent in coming forward, again because of the work they were doing when they fell victim to the gang. They had now moved on and had families, so didn't want their history exposed. When the woman who did come forward told police of her experience with the gang, the investigation team realized the people in custody had likely committed many more cases, and eventually they'd get to the truth. Yang Shubin, Ji Hongjie, Zhang Yuliang and Wu Hongye confessing to collectively committing 10 homicides across the country. Investigators did what they could to identify the other victims, but with no trace of their bodies being found, the number of years since the crimes took place, and the fact sitting women didn't use their real names when working, it proved virtually impossible. Their best hope was for the gang to give them the names of their victims, but they couldn't remember. The most investigators got were some of the women's working names, but they were effectively useless for helping police identify the women whose lives were ended. The men genuinely had long forgotten any names, Yang Shubin rather coldly only remembering the women with how much money he took from their bank accounts. During the interrogations, police also got a view of the quartet's lives after they received their new identities, and it appeared the money they stole didn't give them the lives they expected. Their criminal activity stopped, but they felt a constant sense of paranoia, believing the slightest mistake would expose them, causing the police to come knocking on their doors. They correctly assumed that police would have their fingerprints after examining the apartment the partially dismembered remains were discovered, meaning that if police arrested them protesting their innocence would be futile. So they did everything they could to keep a low profile. They didn't form any close relationships with anyone outside their immediate circle, even then only hanging out together during the Chinese New Year, and apart from going to work didn't socialize with anyone. They kept their businesses cash only so they didn't have to use banks, keeping their money hidden away in safes they bought for their homes. At the time of their arrest they had built up significant savings, largely due to them not having anything to spend the money on. They never left the city of Baotou, never went on holiday, or did anything to enjoy the money they were earning. With the level of caution they displayed in keeping themselves hidden, it surprised detectives that the main reason they were caught was that Yang Shubin didn't give his mother a new name on the false identity documents. Yang Shubin said this was due to his mother suffering with mental health issues for many years, eventually being diagnosed with schizophrenia. He explained that when trying to change her name she struggled to remember it, getting confused and upset when he and his younger brother attempted to use a new name for her. The gang also gave investigators in Harbin the names of the Shanxi police officers who'd given them the new identity documents, which saw 2 officers being arrested and jailed, and another 6 being removed from their positions. The gang's trial wouldn't take place for another 2 years as police attempted to identify the unknown victims whose remains were never found, hoping they could inform the women's families of their relatives' deaths. However, there were too many people reported missing during the years the gang was active, leaving police unable to confidently identify the victims. In 2013, Yang Shubin, Zhang Yuliang, and Ji Hongjie finally went on trial for their crimes. The 4th man, Wu Hongye, had already passed away. At the time of his arrest, Wu Hongye was living on borrowed time, having been diagnosed with lung cancer, and it being fairly advanced. Having confessed to his role in the robbery homicides he participated, he died well before the trial took place. Given the circumstances, he received an early fast-track trial, but saw little time in a jail cell, spending his final days painfully wasting away in hospital. Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang were both handed the death penalty, while Ji Hongjie got the same punishment, albeit with a 2-year suspension. The 2 men would twice appeal their sentences. The first was successful, and a retrial was ordered after an issue emerged related to evidence mishandling during the investigation. On May 20, 2016, the 2 men were back in court, but with the issue resolved, the death penalty judgment was upheld. The 2 men once more appealed their sentences, but this time they would be unsuccessful, and on November 2, 2016, 4 years after being arrested, Yang Shubin and Zhang Yuliang were executed. The death sentence handed to Ji Hongjie was eventually commuted to life in prison. Although she admitted to leading the victims to their deaths, she denied directly participating in the homicides. Neither Zhang Yuliang nor Yang Shubin contradicted her claim, and she also gave the investigation team the most information about the gang's crimes during her confession. She explained that while she picked out the victims, Yang Shubin always had the final say, coming to the dance halls to meet the women himself to see if they were suitable. She was also the only member of the gang who actively assisted police in trying to identify their victims, but it proved to be little help. After the 2-year suspension of her death sentence was over, the punishment was commuted to life in prison. This was due to the combination of there being no evidence she actively ended the lives of the victims, the fact that she helped the police investigation, her good behavior while incarcerated, and being the mother of 2 children. Her sentence was further commuted and she was reportedly released from prison with a new identity in 2023. The story was brought back to the public's attention in early 2025 with the release of the TV miniseries Bai, translating to Bleach, the English name being Drifting Away, which was based on the case. However, despite being well received, a controversy soon broke out. Investigative journalist Wang Wenfeng claimed that the series had plagiarized his own 2012 investigative report covering the case, which was also named Bai. The series screenwriter Chen Ping countered that she'd been commissioned to write a screenplay inspired by the case in 2016, which she eventually turned into her 2022 novel of the same name. She then adapted her own novel into the screenplay for the series, which was exclusive to the video streaming platform iQIYI. Lawyers for Wang Wenfeng argued that while it was legitimate to use factual reporting in producing creative works, in this case the screenplay used their client's original expression numerous times, which amounted to breach of copyright. Chen Ping and the production company saw the civil lawsuit brought against them dismissed, the judge stating that basing creative works on factual events, and the publicly available reports on said events would inevitably lead to similarities between the works. Therefore, there was no case to answer, and the series could continue to be broadcast. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.